Take a minute to think about what you believe constitutes as a healthy diet. Chances are, many of us will have different opinions because we grew up being taught different things. However, many of us will most likely agree that fat is something that should be limited in a healthy diet, because this has been ingrained in our society for a really long time. However, what many people don't know is this is actually not true. This was seen in the negative health effects that occurred when Ansel Keys published a 7-country study that named fat public enemy number 1. Obesity rates began to rise in the same time that Ansel Keys published his study. His research caused unprecedented changes in society, including corruption in the food industry, increased consumption in refined and processed foods, and the practice of adding sugars into foods that don't necessarily need them. Corruption in the food industry happened because businesses wanted to protect the businesses like sugar wanted to protect their business interests from people like John Goodkins, who were saying that sugar was the root of our problem with coronary heart disease. For obvious reasons, the sugar industry didn't like this research, so they began bribing scientists to fabricate research that mitigated the effects of sugar on the body. An example was when John Hickson paid scientists $50,000 to produce research that supported the consumption of this food. This represents the shift of the food industry to providing misguided information to Americans, which meant that we started to consume foods that we didn't know were actually not as healthy for us. Another problem was that the dietary guidelines were first published in 1980, which was based off of this false research that Ansel Keys did. This meant that we began basing our diet. This meant that people were educated on the information that Ansel Keys did. The dietary guidelines were based off of his research, and they supported the consumption. They supported the replacement of fat with carbohydrates, which meant people began consuming more carbohydrates coming from companies that were pumping them with sugar, which I'll discuss soon. Businesses found a lot of profit in revamping foods like yogurt, pretzels, cookies, and cakes to be low fat. People thought this was great, because now we have healthy cookies and cakes because they're low fat, and people were telling them that low fat was healthy. But what they didn't know was businesses had to replace the fat with something to make them taste good. So businesses began pumping these foods with large amounts of sugar, which meant that it was actually worse for us than when they were high in fat. One significant change was when they began putting high fructose corn syrup into foods. High fructose corn syrup was cheaper than sugar, but it was also more processed, which meant it was worse for our bodies. And people began unknowingly consuming more amounts of sugar because it was hidden in foods. There was a large increase in sugar consumption in the 1960s and 70s and onwards because companies began putting sugar into foods to make them taste better. And they found this was great because people were coming back for more because they tasted good with all the sugar in them. Another transition was our transition to margarine over butter. Margarine is a chemically altered food that it's chemically altered to stay solid at room temperature. This was a revolutionary finding because now they had something that was available all year round, unlike butter, and it was cheaper, and it appealed to the low-fat craze because margarine was low in saturated fat. So many people thought this was great because it didn't have much saturated fat, but what they didn't know was that it was high in trans fatty acids, which are way worse than saturated fats. Butter is more healthy because it's less processed and comes from dairy that's a more natural product. This shift to margarine represents our shift to more processed foods and other things that were less healthy for us during the time. We see an increase in margarine around the same time that Ansel Keys said saturated fat and other fats were unhealthy. So people switched to margarine because they didn't realize trans fatty acids existed in margarine. This shift to fundamentally believing that low fat was healthy for us caused many unprecedented changes in society. Companies began creating research that was began fabricating research that was false and misguided, so people began consuming more processed and unhealthy foods in order to replace the fat they were devoiding from their diet. Thank you.